In this video lecture, I'm going to be looking at a book published in 2009 called Revolution at Point Zero by Silvia Federici. We're going to be looking at a couple of the chapters from that book, largely based on feminist struggles in the division of labor. So, globalization is this phenomenon that got started well before the 1990s, but the term really exploded in the 1990s. Basically, globalization is the growing interdependence of the world's economies, cultures, and populations that is brought about by cross-border trade in goods and services, technology, flows of investment, people, and information. So globalization is just simply, one short way to summarize it, it's just the spread of capitalism and market economy to all corners of the globe. Taking markets that don't have any kind of trade or relation with other markets, so perhaps, New York with Hong Kong, or we could say Lima with London, or whatever else, right? Connecting those such that one place produces some kind of technology that is then sold to another place, or, as often is the case now, you have resources that are mined, typically in a lot of cases in the global south, let's say in Africa. This is then sent to, let's say, someplace in Southeast Asia to take those resources and be put together, turned into some commodity that then is sold in, let's say, the United States, right? Things like that. But globalization also refers to the spread of culture as well. Not just these kind of commodities that are explicitly bought and sold on the market, but also think of music, movies, entertainment, things like that as well. Now, within the spread of globalization, there were these things created called free trade zones. So this was any location where goods can be shipped, handled, and manufactured, reconfigured, and then re-exported without the involvement of customs agencies. So this is really, again, got going in the 1990s as the result of neoliberalism. With neoliberalism, this idea that we want to free the market as much as possible, such that anything that was previously done, let's say regulated or owned by government, could then be privatized. We want to let private industry control as much of society as possible, because the idea is, well, the profit motive behind it, it'll lead to competition, which leads to a cheapening of commodities overall, and so everybody is basically consumers, the idea is, and so everybody benefits. And so you have in these free trade zones basically no tariffs, no kind of a government saying, well, if you bring this thing in, you're going to have to pay this kind of a tax, or it's going to be regulated, and how it's produced, etc. The idea behind this is, of course, that a rising tide lifts all boats. So as globalization increases, then what should happen is you have traditional hierarchies, perhaps based on caste system, or the patriarchy, or serfdom, whatever else, right? These would fall apart as the market would kind of free up populations to pursue industry in whatever the way they want, free persons to pursue the kinds of jobs they want, and not just what they have to work because it's a custom or anything like that. So the idea is people will become overall more economically secure. They will live a better life, so their well-being will increase, and they will ultimately then be more free. Now, the question that Federici asks is, has capitalism actually, through globalization, been the great equalizer by eliminating historical hierarchies and specifically the sexual division of labor in the third world? And the third world basically just refers to any country that was not aligned during the Cold War. So the first world was considered to be the capitalist countries, NATO, the United States, Japan, etc. The second world then would have been any of the communist Soviet Union aligned countries. So the third world, typically we think of like much of South America, much of South and Southeast Asia, and much of Africa. Now, in answering this question, Federici argues that actually exploitation has proliferated, it has grown, it has exploded in the wake of globalization. And I want to read specifically what she says here. So she says, she's talking about free trade zones, and she says, as for the women employed in the free trade zones, their organizations have denounced that this work generates underdevelopment and is a hidden form of slavery. Wages in the free trade zones are kept below subsistence levels, many times lower than the minimum wages in industrialized countries, through all forms of intimidation. In Indonesia, work in the free trade zone pays so little that the workers' families must supplement their income through other kinds of work that they can hopefully find. Additionally, she says, women are forced to work long hours in unsafe conditions, are subjected to daily body searches to check if they take anything out of the plants. They are often forced to take birth control pills to ensure they do not get pregnant, so therefore they don't disrupt production, and their movements are restricted. In many cases, they are locked up until they fill their work quotas, so that both in Mexico and China, hundreds have died because they could not flee from buildings shaken by an earthquake or burning up in flames. And in every country, they are persecuted when they try to organize. Despite these harsh conditions, workers in the free trade zones have not been passive victims of the penetration of capitalist relations in their communities. From Mexico to the Philippines and the Caribbean islands, women workers in the free trade zones have built support networks and organized struggles that have put the company managers and their governments who had given the green light to the free trade zones on the defensive. Nevertheless, any optimism concerning the economic impact on free trade zones, on the workers they employ, is misplaced. For their very reason of existence is to create a work environment in which workers have no rights. Okay, so that's her argument, her account of why exploitation has proliferated. She also argues that reproductive work, so the work of raising children, taking care of families, that this kind of work done by women has often been obfuscated through globalization, and especially in free trade zones, even though it's essential for the production of commodities. Because you can't have all these kinds of workers in the global south, you can't have all these kinds of workers in free trade zones if you don't have children that are raised, that are taken care of, that eventually become adult workers, or as often is the case actually, you have child labor. And this requires typically women, the mothers, to take care of the children, to take care of essentially the commodities upon which these companies rely. Commodities in the form of labor, of course. Now, what we find then through globalization, and because these free trade zones are typically in places in the third world, we find, she says, that the most important commodity that the third world exports to the first world is labor. That we typically think of then globalization as this explosion in trade, and we think of then goods, things that you can buy and sell in a marketplace, in a store, and so on. And while that is true, the largest import is labor itself. She says, in other words, as in the past, today as well, capitalist accumulation is above all the accumulation of workers, a process that occurs primarily through immigration. This means that a significant part of the work necessary to reproduce the metropolitan workforce is now performed by women in Africa, Asia, Latin America, or the former socialist countries, the main points of origin of the contemporary migratory movements. She also says, by introducing restrictions that force immigrant workers to be undocumented, immigration can be used to cut the cost of labor. For only if immigrants are socially and politically devalued can immigration be used to contain the demands of the local working class. So what we find is, as globalization explodes, as it proliferates, we have an explosion in migration, because while these countries come in and they want to try and take resources, build factories and so on that often, again, pay low wages and so on. This leads in a lot of cases where local companies or local persons, individuals, can actually compete with those new corporations and businesses that move to the third world. Because there's not much job opportunity there, they end up moving to places in the first world. They immigrate for a better chance to make a decent living. And what we find then is there's actually this kind of contradiction here, where at one and the same time the first world wants to limit immigration to their countries, and yet they actually depend on that immigration. Why? Well, because if you're a capitalist, you can pay less to, for example, an illegal immigrant, someone who's not formally recognized by government, because, well, if they don't like the wage, it's already tough to try and find a job as an illegal immigrant. And who are you going to go and complain to if, your boss is paying you less than the minimum wage? You can't go and complain to the government because you're not allowed to work in the first place. So it actually then pits workers against workers. And so what happens is the bosses and the owners, the capitalist class, benefit from illegal labor, because what that means is it makes other workers mad at other workers for suppressing their wages, not making them realize that actually it's the capitalist who's deciding to take advantage of these illegal immigrants, these people who are in precarious situations. We also have the issue that, as Federici says, the largest actually exportation from the first to the third world after oil is remittances. Those who cannot migrate to the first world from the third world, or do not have access to remittances sent by immigrants, though, they face a life of great hardships. Because usually what happens is you have this extraction from what we can think of as the periphery to the center. The center being the big, cities, the mega cities. And what that means is, over time, you have more and more of a concentration, more of an extraction, both in resources and in labor, in actual human beings, from the third world to the first. Further, in the case of women, specifically in the case of women, Federici argues that the obfuscation of reproductive work by globalization, because of course in globalization you don't have a formal recognition of reproductive labor as real labor, that this then leads to a further exploitation of the subordinate position of women in the division of labor. So whereas globalization claims it can undermine and eventually dissolve the traditional hierarchies, for example, patriarchal hierarchies, Federici claims actually in the case of the third world, what happens is, because reproductive work is obfuscated, you have actually this pitting of women against women on a class basis. She says, the employment of Filipino or Mexican women who, for a modest sum, clean houses, raise children, prepare meals, take care of the elderly, allows many middle-class women to escape a work that they do not want or can no longer perform without simultaneously reducing their standard of living. However, this solution is problematic, as it creates a maids-madams relation among women, complicated by the biases surrounding housework, the assumption that it is not real work and should be paid as little as possible, that it does not have defined boundaries, and so forth. So what we find is there's often this, because globalization doesn't recognize reproductive work as real work, and so you need women then to enter the labor force. And traditionally the idea was, well, if you have women enter the labor force, of course, this means they can make their own money, they won't be dependent on the man of the house, a husband. And that's true. That definitely is true. But the problem is it doesn't recognize the fact that it's still a majority women who are giving birth to children, who then have to take care typically of children. And so you typically have then more upper class women that won't take care of their children, but hire lower class women to take care of their children. So you have then this class dichotomy among women themselves that Federici sees as creating tension between a solidarity of women. Now, some other further kinds of exploitation she mentions is that there's the development of an international baby market that has now evolved into a multi-billion-dollar business. So you have basically the trading of babies as commodities from the third world to the first world. Second, you have the massification of the sex industry and sex tourism. So a lot of women from the third world will come to the first world to work, in strip clubs or things like that. And it's not to say that it's not real work or it can't be legitimate. The issue is that you have people who are in precarious situations where if they want to make a decent livelihood, that's their best bet, is to go into this kind of sex work. Whereas if you're of the upper class, if you're from the first world, it's not as much of a requirement to enter that kind of industry. Or in the case of sex tourism, you have the case where a lot of times you have places in like Southeast Asia and so on where you kind of have these known places that are thought of as like hotbeds of prostitution and things like that, where men from the first world will go to tour. Finally, she says we have the kind of proliferation of the mail order brides industry, where women are, in a sense, bought to become housewives or wives in general from the third world to the first world. So we have all those kinds of situations where you have, again, migration from the third world to the first world, but especially in that case, in all these cases, women are exploited because it's not that they have some real choice, whereas if they don't decide to give in to, let's say, being a mail order bride or something else, that they could equally make a living doing something else. They really don't. In a lot of cases, they don't really have that kind of a practical choice, so to speak. So I've summarized Federici's argument in this outline here. So her first premise is that if globalization proliferates, then it will eliminate historical hierarchies and undermine the sexual division of labor. So this is the claim made by those who argue in defense of globalization. Her second premise, though, is that globalization has actually caused a major crisis in the social reproduction of populations in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, continuing to produce poverty, disease, and war. And we see this especially in the case of women, where it's introduced new divisions among women that undermine the possibility of international feminist solidarity. Therefore, the third premise, feminist politics must subvert the new international division of labor and the globalization project from which it originates. Premise 4. This cannot be done by separating the demand for equality from a critique of the role of international capital. So we can't talk about equality or freedom as something not inherently related to class analysis or material circumstances. So her conclusion is that, therefore, feminist politics must subvert the new international division of labor by demanding a return of the expropriated lands, the non-payment of foreign debt, and the abolition of structural adjustment and land privatization. Now, one question I think that might be, at first right to be asked is, should women who are employed in domestic work be criticized? Because it seems like those kinds of women are, if it's the case that there's being this kind of maids madam kind of tension among women, and then it seems like, well, those who are performing the labor of doing housework are kind of undermining solidarity among women. But what Federici says is that as long as reproductive work remains an individual or family responsibility, we may not have much of a choice, particularly when we have to care for people who are ill or not self-sufficient, and in addition have jobs outside the home. So as long as it is the case that people are found in economically precarious situations and that this is the alternative they have to pursue, then it is not correct from a feminist perspective to criticize women for performing, housework, for women being the main kinds of people who do perform housework, cleaning and things like that. What needs to be done, she says, is that reproductive work should be recognized by the state as legitimate work. Now, how exactly would this work? It's not entirely clear. This remains to be determined. But some options could include, in the case of welfare, so perhaps, you could have a kind of UBI, such that, all women or all, individuals or all parents receive a monthly stipend, basically, since they do a kind of work that is raising, educating children, and children become workers. Workers are seen as a commodity by capitalists. Well, in that case, what's responsible for producing the commodity? Well, the labor of the parents who raise the children such that they can enter the workforce. Perhaps this could be done through a child tax credit, or there might be other kind of ways where this could be pursued. Now, for the rest of this, what I want to look at is one of the potential alternatives to globalization, to the commodification of basically all spheres of life. What Federici wants to look at is a return to the commons. Can the commons be that kind of place that we can turn away from globalization? So in beginning to think about this, she says that we have to recognize that the neoliberal attempt to subordinate every form of life and knowledge to the logic of the market has heightened our awareness of the danger of living in a world in which we no longer have access to seas, to trees, animals, and our fellow beings except through the cash nexus. That basically neoliberalism, this drive to privatize everything, to commodify everything, to try and turn everything into a profit-making endeavor. This has made it such that it seems like we no longer have a commons anymore. If you think about in the United States, what can you do to just go enjoy yourself, to have fun, right? Most places require some form of payment, okay? There's no real kind of like public square such that you can just hang out with someone without having to pay money in some form. Now, yes, there are parks. Generally, though, of course, that requires driving. That requires then you have to have a car. You have to pay for the car, the gas, and so on. But typically, we think of the movies, a restaurant, a cafe where you have to pay. Laser tag or some other kind of activity. Typically, that requires paying for access to just kind of enjoy your free time. Now, what we found, though, according to Federici, is that it's not just the case that everything has become privatized such that there's no longer a commons, but it's actually even the idea of the commons now, she says, has been appropriated by private interests. She says, under the guise of protecting biodiversity and conserving global commons, the World Bank has turned rainforests into ecological reserves, has expelled the populations that for centuries had drawn their sustenance from them, while making them available to people who do not need them, for instance, through ecotourism. On its side, the United Nations, in the name again of preserving the common heritage of mankind, has revised the international law governing access to the oceans in ways that enable governments to consolidate the use of seawaters in fewer hands. One actually pro-market position that would be critical of this drive to privatize everything, so in defense of markets, would be that it might actually be the case that the commodification of all spheres of life is actually detrimental to the market's well-functioning, because there are some aspects of social life that don't function well if put into a profit incentive, like maybe, for example, parenting, just to think of one example. So, the question that Federici has is if international institutions can make commons functional to the market, how can the commons become the foundation of a non-capitalist economy? Is it the case that there can be a renewed look at the commons such that the commons can show us a way that we can subvert the dominant global order? Now, some cases where she sees the commons as being an example of class struggle are where there are Mainers who fight to preserve fisheries and waters as available to any individual to pursue, and not just only for, let's say, corporations or a business. We have in the case Appalachians who try to save their mountains from strip mining, and open source and free software movements that oppose the commodification of knowledge. Now, especially in this last case, as an academic, I know all too well that usually if you want to do some kind of research, it's behind a paywall. Now, luckily, right, as being affiliated with an institution, the institution, pays a fee. A university pays a fee such that, well, if I'm affiliated with the institution, I get to access that article. But that means if you're not affiliated, so if you're not a student or you're not a faculty member of that institution, you typically don't have access to the knowledge that is published in articles. Or if you want to read a book or something like that, unless you pay the publisher, money, you can't have access to that knowledge. So there's been a movement for open access, that all knowledge should be open to anyone interested and not only to those who can pay. Another example of the commons that could potentially be a kind of subversive avenue against globalization is urban gardens. She says the gardens are far more than a source of food security. They are centers of sociality, knowledge production, cultural and intergenerational exchange. Still, the most significant feature of urban gardens is that they produce for neighborhood consumption rather than for commercial purposes. So, the question is, can urban gardens and their basis in the commons, more generally, be more than a spontaneous grassroots initiative? And additionally, can a renewed interest in the commons be useful for feminist politics? This is the big question. So, in looking at the commons from a feminist perspective, she says, as the primary subjects of reproductive work, it is women who have depended more than men on access to communal resources, and they have been most committed, in fact, to their defense. Quote, in the first phase of capitalist development, women were in the front of the struggle against land enclosures both in England and the New World. And they were the staunchest defenders of the communal cultures that European colonization attempted to destroy. In Peru, when the Spanish conquistadores took control of their villages, women fled to the high mountains, where they recreated forms of collective life that have survived to this day. Most surprisingly, the 16th and 17th centuries saw the most violent attack on women in the history of the world, where we saw the persecution of women as witches. So today, in the face of a new process of primitive accumulation, such that you have a primitive accumulation of the commons, or individuals through labor themselves, such that these were things not previously commodified, women, Federici says, are the main social force standing in the way of a complete commercialization of nature. 3 reasons why. First, women are the subsistence farmers of the world. Now, whether it's in Africa, producing 80% of the food people consume, or in India, restoring degraded forests, Federici finds that in the third world, it is women, most often in the case, where they defend and try to protect those areas of commons that are left. Secondly, there are some examples where women have actually formed credit associations that function as money commons that are autonomous, self-managing bank systems, providing cash to individuals or groups with no access to banks. And it's often the case that banks are really pernicious in these vulnerable communities in the third world, in the global south, where it can be the case that someone who has taken out money from a bank, taken out a loan, and fallen behind on the payments will find their faces plastered on posters all around their village, right? These private banks will do that. But these credit associations run by women don't do that. They work on mutual trust. And third, women have led the effort to collectivize reproductive labor in the case of common kitchens. If the commons is to be a viable alternative to globalization, the production of commons requires first a profound transformation in our everyday life. Federici says we need to overcome the state of constant denial and irresponsibility concerning the consequences of our actions, resulting from the destructive ways in which the social division of labor is organized in capitalism. Short of that, the production of our life inevitably becomes a production of death for others. We have to think about the way that globalization, the commodification of all spheres of life, entails growth on the one hand and death on the other. That often it's the case that the more we commodify, the more kinds of primitive accumulation that occurs, the more perhaps we disrupt fundamental ecosystems. We make it more likely that certain species go extinct. We make it more likely that different kind of ways of life are put under threat by globalization. So community, we have to understand, is, according to Federici, a quality of relations. It requires principles of cooperation and responsibility to each other, the earth, forests, the seas, and the animals. Secondly, housework must be collectivized and communalized. She says, despite the efforts that futuristic industrialists are making, we cannot robotize care, except at a terrible cost for the people involved. No one will accept nurse bots as caregivers, especially for children and the ill. Shared responsibility and cooperative work, not given at the cost of the health of the providers, are the only guarantees of proper care. It can't be the case that we just turn to a privatization of all kinds of care for our parents, care for our family members as they get older, or if they get sick. That we have to see there is value, and often the case that we find, for example, in the third world, where it is the responsibility of family members to take care of their family members, and it's up to a community or a government to ensure that that is still possible. And that it's not the case that because a family member becomes sick, no one can ever take time off work to take care of them, so they have to use the money that they make from working to pay someone else to take care of their family members. Now, this is not to say that Federici thinks you should never pay someone else to take care of your family members. Of course, if someone is ill and requires specialized care, it should be the case that you seek out that specialized care. But it shouldn't be the default or even the kind of necessary way that our family members are taken care of, that it's our only alternative in privatizing care. Finally, if the house is the oikos, the kind of home economy on which the larger economy is built, then Federici says it is women, historically houseworkers and house prisoners, who must take the initiative to reclaim the house as a center of collective life. Now, this is her most important claim here in considering the commons as a kind of subversive avenue. But an important question arises. Might this thesis of hers naturalize housework as a female vocation? Might it not be sexist to say it's actually the responsibility of women to kind of take this initiative to reclaim the house as a center of collective life? What Federici says in response to this is that it is refusing to obliterate the collective experiences, knowledge, and struggles that women have accumulated concerning reproductive work, whose history has been an essential part of our resistance to capitalism. So as to say, it's not the case that women must only ever be involved in reproductive care. But historically, it is women who have this kind of generational knowledge that then should take that knowledge and fight for the fact that, in a sense, they have greater claim to know how to fight back against the commodification of the commons, of reproductive life. It's a kind of rallying cry in the same way, according to Marx, that it's on the responsibility of the proletariat, of the workers, to take control of their conditions. This same thing here is being made by Federici. In the case of workers, it's not the case that they should only ever then be workers, but it's to transcend through their own effort. It's to transcend the defining of a worker as really only a worker, which is what capitalism says. In the same way, then, Federici is arguing women must take that initiative to transcend the idea that women are only good at reproductive labor, and that through that, the commons can be used as a subversive means against the exploitation of globalization.